You're fired. Emma Carter's grip tightened on the silver serving tray as Mason Sullivan's voice cut through the elegant restaurant like a blade. The words weren't directed at her, but at Marcus, the trembling waiter who had accidentally spilled wine on a client's suit jacket 3 tables away. "Mr. Sullivan, please, I can pay for the dry cleaning," Marcus pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. The entire dining room had fallen silent, 40 pairs of eyes witnessing the public execution. Emma had been working at Hotel Sullivan for exactly 4 hours. 4 hours of memorizing table numbers, learning the computerized ordering system, and studying the faces of Manhattan's elite who frequented the establishment. 4 hours of preparation for this moment, though she hadn't expected it to come so soon. Mason Sullivan stood 6 feet away from her, his tailored charcoal suit impeccable despite the late afternoon hour. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and those steel blue eyes that had graced countless business magazine covers showed no mercy as he towered over Marcus. "The dry cleaning bill is $800, Mason said, his voice carrying the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. "Your monthly salary is $2,200. You do the math." Emma's stomach churned. She had studied this man for months, poring over articles about his business practices, his family's hotel empire, his reputation for ruthless efficiency. But seeing him destroy someone's livelihood over an accident hit her differently than she had expected. Marcus's face crumpled. He was maybe 22, probably working his way through college like half the staff. The client whose suit was stained had already waved off the incident, calling it no big deal, but Mason seemed determined to make an example. "Security will escort you out," Mason continued, already turning away as if Marcus had ceased to exist. That's when Emma moved. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor with deliberate confidence. The fake identification documents that had gotten her this job were solid, purchased from a contact who specialized in providing new identities for people who needed them. Her story was rehearsed. Emma Carter from Ohio, working her way through community college, references from restaurants that existed, but whose managers had been paid to corroborate her employment history. "Excuse me, Mr. Sullivan." Mason's head turned toward her, eyebrows raising slightly. Up close, he was even more imposing than his photos suggested. There was something predatory in the way he assessed her, as if calculating her net worth and finding it insufficient. "You are Emma Carter, sir. I started today." She kept her voice steady, professional. "I couldn't help but notice that Mr. Hendricks over there seems completely unbothered by the wine stain." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Hendricks is not the one making personnel decisions." "Of course not. But he is the client who was affected by the accident." Emma gestured toward the businessman in question, who was now deep in conversation with his dining companion, having clearly moved past the incident. And accidents happen in every restaurant, even the best ones. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Emma could feel the attention of every person in the restaurant, staff and customers alike. Marcus stood frozen behind Mason, probably wondering if this new waitress was insane or stupid. Mason took a step closer to her, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. "Are you suggesting that I don't know how to run my own establishment, Miss Carter?" Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held his gaze. "I'm suggesting that firing excellent employees over accidents that don't bother the customers might not be the most profitable approach." Profitable? Mason's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've been here 4 hours and you're giving me business advice." "I've been in restaurants for 6 years, Emma lied smoothly. "Long enough to know that training replacements costs more than replacing a suit." It was a calculated risk. Everything about this moment was calculated, from her decision to intervene to the way she was standing with her shoulders back and chin up, meeting his intimidating stare with steady determination. She had come here to investigate this man, to find evidence of the corruption that had killed her father. She hadn't planned to save anyone's job on her first day. Mason studied her for what felt like an eternity. Then he turned to Marcus. "The cost of the dry cleaning comes out of your next paycheck," he said finally. "Don't let it happen again." Marcus's relief was visible as he nodded rapidly and hurried away, shooting Emma a grateful look over his shoulder. Mason turned back to Emma, and this time his expression was different. Calculating. Interested. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice lower now, meant only for her ears. "I think we need to have a conversation." Emma nodded, aware that she had just done something that would change everything. She had revealed herself as someone who wasn't afraid of him, someone willing to challenge his authority. In a man like Mason Sullivan, that would either spark curiosity or fury. As he gestured for her to follow him toward his private office, Emma wondered if she had just made the first move in a very dangerous game. Mason's office occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Sullivan Hotel, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Central Park. Emma had expected luxury, but the understated elegance surprised her. No gaudy displays of wealth, just clean lines, expensive materials, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from never having to prove anything. "Sit," Mason said, settling behind his mahogany desk. He didn't offer her coffee or water, didn't engage in small talk. Everything about his posture screamed control. Emma chose the chair across from him, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. She had practiced this moment countless times, but being in the actual room with him felt different. The man who might have been complicit in her father's death was studying her with those sharp blue eyes, and she had to resist the urge to look away. "Tell me about your previous experience," Mason said, leaning back in his chair. Emma launched into her prepared story about working at various restaurants in Ohio, mixing truth with fiction in a way that would be difficult to verify. She mentioned the names of establishments that existed, referenced managers who would back up her story if called, and described incidents that had actually happened to other people. Mason listened without interruption, but she could see him cataloging every detail. This was a man who had built a business empire by reading people, by finding their weaknesses and exploiting them. The fact that she had challenged him downstairs had clearly piqued his interest, but it had also put her squarely in his crosshairs. "You said you've been in restaurants for 6 years, he said when she finished. "That would make you, what, 22 when you started?" 20. The lie came easily. Her real age was 26, but her fake documents reflected the younger number. 16 years old when you graduated high school, then. Emma felt the first flutter of unease. He was probing, looking for inconsistencies. "I was always good at school. Graduated early." "Which high school?" "Lincoln High in Columbus." Another lie, but one backed up by forged transcripts. Mason made a note on a legal pad, and Emma realized he would probably verify her story. The people she had paid to create her background were professionals, but nothing was foolproof. "Why New York?" he asked. "Better opportunities. Higher tips." Emma shrugged, trying to project the casual ambition of a young woman seeking her fortune in the big city. "And you chose my hotel specifically because..." This was the crucial moment. Emma had rehearsed this answer, but delivering it while looking into his eyes proved more challenging than expected. "Best restaurant in Manhattan. If I'm going to work somewhere, might as well be the top." Mason's smile was predatory. "Flattery, Miss Carter?" "Fact, Mr. Sullivan." Something shifted in his expression. For just a moment, she saw surprise, as if he wasn't used to people being direct with him without being either sycophantic or afraid. "You intrigue me," he said finally. "That little performance downstairs showed backbone. Most people in your position would have kept their heads down." "I'm not most people." "No, you're not." Mason stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Which is why I'm making you an offer." Emma's pulse quickened. This wasn't part of her plan, but opportunities had to be seized when they arose. "I need a new personal assistant," Mason continued, still facing the window. "Someone intelligent, observant, not easily intimidated. The pay is significantly better than waitressing, and you'd learn more about business operations than you ever would carrying plates." Emma forced herself to consider the offer for exactly the right amount of time. Too quick, and she'd seem desperate. Too long, and she'd seem ungrateful. What would my responsibilities be? Managing my schedule, handling correspondence, attending meetings, various administrative tasks. Mason turned back to face her. "You'd essentially be my right hand for everything that doesn't require years of experience." "When would I start?" "Tomorrow." His smile was sharp. "Assuming you're interested." Emma stood, extending her hand toward him. "I'm very interested, Mr. Sullivan." When their hands touched, she felt an unexpected jolt of electricity. Mason's grip was firm, lasting just a moment longer than strictly professional. His eyes held hers, and for that brief instant, Emma forgot why she was really here. "Excellent," Mason said, releasing her hand. "Report to the executive floor at 8 a.m. Sarah Henderson, my current assistant, We'll train you before she transfers to our London property." As Emma left his office, her mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities this promotion offered. As his personal assistant, she would have access to files, schedules, and communications that could provide the evidence she needed about her father's death. James Carter had been a freelance accountant, hired by Sullivan Hotels to audit their quarterly reports 2 years ago. According to the police report, he had jumped from his apartment balcony after leaving a suicide note citing financial problems and depression. But Emma knew her father. He had never shown signs of depression, and his finances, while not lavish, were stable. The suicide note itself had been the first red flag. Her father was left-handed, but the note was written with his right hand. The police had dismissed her concerns, suggesting that people under extreme stress sometimes exhibited unusual behavior. Emma had spent months investigating quietly, using her savings to hire a private investigator who had uncovered interesting information about the timing of her father's death. James Carter had died just 3 days after submitting his final report to Sullivan Hotels, a report that had apparently satisfied all parties involved. But something had bothered her father in those final days. He had called her twice, mentioning concerns about irregularities in the books, numbers that didn't add up. He had been planning to reach out to the authorities about potential fraud when he allegedly decided to end his life. Now, with access to Mason Sullivan's inner circle, Emma might finally find the proof she needed. As the elevator descended to the main floor, Emma caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. She looked calm, professional, competent. No one would guess that beneath her composed exterior, she was planning to bring down the man who had just offered her the opportunity of a lifetime. Emma's first morning as Mason's personal assistant began at 7:45 a.m. with Sarah Henderson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who looked like she could run a small country from her desk. "Mr. Sullivan takes his coffee black, no sugar, and he wants it waiting when he arrives at 8:15, Sarah said, leading Emma through the executive suite. "He reads the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Financial Times every morning. Print copies, not digital. He's old-fashioned that way." Emma nodded, taking mental notes while her eyes cataloged everything around her. The assistant's desk sat just outside Mason's office, positioned to control access while offering a clear view of the elevator bank. File cabinets lined one wall, and Emma noticed they required key cards for access. These files contained confidential information about hotel operations, financial reports, personnel records, Sarah continued, following Emma's gaze. "Your access level will be determined by Mr. Sullivan, but generally, anything marked with a red tab is off-limits." Emma's pulse quickened. Red tabs likely meant the most sensitive documents, exactly what she needed to find. "The calendar system is computerized, but Mr. Sullivan prefers printed schedules each morning," Sarah went on. "He has standing meetings with department heads on Mondays, the CFO Robert Mitchell every Wednesday, and board meetings the first Friday of each month." Robert Mitchell. Emma filed the name away, though she already knew it from her research. The CFO had been with Sullivan Hotels for 8 years, starting just after graduating from Wharton. Her father had mentioned concerns about irregularities that seemed to trace back to financial reporting, which would fall under Mitchell's purview. "Questions so far?" Sarah asked. "How long have you worked for Mr. Sullivan?" 3 years. "He's demanding but fair, as long as you don't try to manage him." Sarah's smile held a warning. "He doesn't like surprises, he doesn't tolerate mistakes, and he values loyalty above almost everything else." At 8:15 exactly, the elevator doors opened and Mason stepped out. He looked even more imposing than he had yesterday, if that was possible. His navy suit was impeccably tailored, his dark hair perfectly styled, and those steel blue eyes swept the reception area with the efficiency of a security scan. "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan," Emma said, offering him the coffee and printed newspapers. "Your 9 o'clock with the marketing team has been moved to 9:30. The contracts from the Chicago property arrived this morning and are on your desk for review." Mason paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. "How did you know about the marketing meeting change?" "I called to confirm all your appointments when I arrived this morning. Jennifer mentioned they needed the extra time to prepare their presentation." Something shifted in Mason's expression. Approval, maybe, or surprise that she had taken initiative. "Efficient," he said. "I like that." For the next 4 hours, Emma threw herself into the role with genuine enthusiasm. The work itself was engaging, requiring her to coordinate with multiple departments, manage complex schedules, and handle sensitive communications. But more importantly, it gave her legitimate reasons to access files and observe the inner workings of Sullivan Hotels. Around noon, Mason called her into his office to review correspondence. He sat behind his desk while she took the chair across from him, a stack of letters and contracts between them. "The insurance claim from the Boston property needs my signature," he said, sliding a document toward her. "But first, I want you to call Robert Mitchell and confirm the figures match what he submitted last week." Emma's heart rate spiked. This was exactly the kind of access she needed. "Should I pull the report from the files?" "Red cabinet, second drawer. The key card is in my desk." Mason opened a drawer and handed her a plastic card. "And Emma, that information is confidential. It doesn't leave this floor." Emma nodded, trying to project calm professionalism while her mind raced. Access to the financial files was more than she had hoped for on her first day. The red cabinet opened smoothly with Mason's keycard. Emma found the Boston property file and several others, her fingers brushing against folders marked with her father's initials. J.C. James Carter. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. The insurance report seemed straightforward, matching the figures Robert Mitchell had submitted. But as Emma compared documents, she noticed something odd. The property damage assessment was dated March 15th, but the initial incident report was dated March 20th. A 5-day discrepancy that might mean nothing or might indicate someone had filed an insurance claim before the damage actually occurred. "Find everything you need?" Mason's voice came from directly behind her. Emma jumped, turning to find him standing close enough that she could smell his cologne. When had he moved from behind his desk? "Yes, the figures match," she managed, acutely aware of how his presence seemed to fill the space around her. "Good." Mason's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "You're very thorough, Emma. I appreciate attention to detail." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken, and not entirely from fear. There was an intensity in the way he looked at her, a heat that had nothing to do with business. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." "Mason," he corrected, his voice dropping slightly. "I think we can dispense with formalities." Emma nodded, very aware that they were standing close together in the small alcove formed by the file cabinets. If anyone walked into the office, this would look intimate, almost compromising. "The Boston report raises some questions," she said, trying to redirect the conversation to safer ground. "What kind of questions?" "The timeline seems inconsistent. The damage assessment predates the incident report." Mason frowned, taking the folder from her hands. As he did, his fingers brushed hers, sending an unexpected jolt of electricity up her arm. "Probably just a clerical error," he said, but his tone suggested he was taking her observation seriously. "I'll have Robert look into it." As they walked back toward his desk, Emma realized she was in dangerous territory. Not just because of the investigation, but because of the way her body was responding to Mason's proximity. The man she had come here to investigate was proving to be far more complex than she had expected and infinitely more attractive. When she sat down across from him again, Mason's gaze lingered on her face. "Tell me, Emma," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What do you think of Sullivan Hotels so far?" "Impressive operation. Very well organized." "That's a diplomatic answer." Mason smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, it seemed genuine. "I'm more interested in your honest opinion." Emma considered her words carefully. "I think you've built something remarkable, but I also think you don't trust easily." "Trust is earned. Then I guess I'll have to earn it." The statement hung between them, loaded with implications that had nothing to do with business. Emma saw something flicker in Mason's eyes, something that made her stomach flutter with anticipation and apprehension in equal measure. She was supposed to be investigating him, not developing feelings for him. But as the afternoon wore on, Emma began to realize that Mason Sullivan was going to be far more dangerous than she had anticipated, and not for the reasons she had originally thought. The Manhattan Children's Hospital Gala drew New York's elite like moths to a flame, and Emma found herself in the middle of it all, clipboard in hand, ensuring Mason's evening ran smoothly. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and designer gowns, the kind of event where a single table cost more than most people made in a month. Emma wore a simple black dress she had purchased that afternoon, professional enough for her role as Mason's assistant, but elegant enough not to embarrass him in front of his peers. She watched him work the room with practiced ease, shaking hands with politicians, laughing at billionaires' jokes, and writing checks that would fund hospital wings. "Mr. Sullivan's table is ready for the auction portion," Emma murmured into her earpiece, coordinating with the event staff. She had been managing his schedule and communications all evening, but something felt different tonight. Mason seemed more tense than usual, checking his phone frequently and scanning the crowd as if looking for someone. "Emma." Mason appeared at her elbow, his jaw tight with barely concealed stress. "I need you to handle the silent auction bids. Whatever the hospital needs, make sure we're the highest bidder." "All of them?" Emma asked, surprised. The silent auction included everything from vacation packages to artwork, easily totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. "All of them." Mason's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. His face went pale. "Excuse me." He stepped away toward the terrace, and Emma watched through the glass doors as he answered the call. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand raked through his hair. "Quite the generous boss you have there." Emma turned to find a man in his mid-40s approaching, champagne glass in hand. He was average height with graying hair and calculating eyes behind expensive glasses. Something about his smile made her skin crawl. "Robert Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "CFO of Sullivan Hotels. You must be the new assistant everyone's talking about." Emma shook his hand, noting how his grip lingered just a moment too long. "Emma Carter. Nice to meet you." "Carter." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly, as if the name meant something to him. Unusual surname. Any relation to the Carters from Ohio? The question seemed innocent enough, but Emma's instincts screamed danger. "It's a pretty common name." "Of course it is." Robert's smile widened. "I have an excellent memory for names, though. Comes with the territory in finance." "Speaking of which, how are you finding the work?" Mason can be quite demanding. "I enjoy the challenge." "I'm sure you do." Robert stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You know, if you ever need anything, or if you have questions about how things work around here, my door is always open. Sometimes it helps to have allies in high places." Before Emma could respond, Mason reappeared, sliding the phone into his jacket pocket. His face was composed, but Emma caught the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his cufflinks. "Robert," Mason said, his voice carefully neutral. "Enjoying the evening? Always do at these charity events. Just getting acquainted with your new assistant." Robert's smile never wavered. "Lovely girl. Very professional." Mason's gaze flicked between Robert and Emma, something protective flashing in his eyes. "Emma, could you check on our table? I believe they're starting the live auction soon." It was clearly a dismissal, and Emma nodded, moving away but staying close enough to observe. Robert and Mason spoke in low tones for several minutes, their body language suggesting a conversation that was anything but friendly. When Robert finally walked away, Mason's expression was thunderous. "Everything all right?" Emma asked when she returned to his side. Mason was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the glittering crowd. "My sister Jessica is in rehab," he said finally, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "That was her facility calling. She's had a setback." Emma felt her chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. "I'm sorry. Is she okay?" "Define okay." Mason's laugh was bitter. "She's 24 years old, and this is her third attempt at getting clean. The doctors say she's stable, but stable is relative when you're talking about cocaine addiction." The vulnerability in his voice caught Emma off guard. This wasn't the cold, calculating businessman she had been investigating. This was a man worried about his sister, carrying guilt and fear that he couldn't fix with money or power. "The hospital bills alone would bankrupt most families," Mason continued. "But that's not the real cost. The real cost is watching someone you love destroy themselves and knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it." Emma found herself reaching out, her hand covering his on the table. "You're doing everything you can." Mason looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. "Are you speaking from experience?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Emma realized she had responded with genuine emotion, not the careful performance she had been maintaining. "My father struggled with depression," she said, which was partially true. James Carter had been devastated when Emma's mother died, though he had never shown signs of the clinical depression mentioned in his alleged suicide note. "I'm sorry," Mason said, turning his hand palm up to capture her fingers. I shouldn't have assumed. You didn't assume anything. Emma was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin against hers, the way his thumb was tracing small circles on her wrist. And for what it's worth, I think you're a good brother. Something shifted in Mason's expression. The careful mask he wore slipped, revealing something raw and honest underneath. You don't know me very well, Emma. I'm learning. The words came out softer than she intended, almost intimate. Mason's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, and Emma felt her breath catch. We should go, Mason said, but he made no move to stand. The auction's over, and I have early meetings tomorrow. Of course. Emma started to pull her hand away, but Mason's grip tightened. Emma. Her name on his lips sounded different, rougher. I want you to know that tonight. Having you here, it helped. Thank you. Before she could respond, he was standing, pulling her up with him. They made their way through the crowd toward the exit, Mason's hands settling on the small of her back to guide her through the press of people. Outside the plaza, Mason's driver waited with the car, but instead of getting in immediately, Mason turned to face Emma on the sidewalk. The night air was cool, and the city lights cast everything in a warm glow. I meant what I said in there, Mason said, stepping closer. About tonight helping. Emma looked up at him, seeing past the expensive suit and carefully styled hair to the man underneath. Mason. He kissed her then, cutting off whatever she had been about to say. His lips were warm and sure, and Emma found herself kissing him back without thinking, her hands fisting in his jacket as he pulled her closer. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Emma stared up at him, her mind spinning with the implications of what had just happened. This is complicated, she whispered. Everything worthwhile is complicated, Mason replied, his thumb brushing across her cheek. As his driver opened the car door and they slid into the back seat, Emma's mind raced. She had come here to investigate Mason Sullivan, to find evidence that he was involved in her father's death. Instead, she was falling for him, seeing sides of him that contradicted everything she thought she knew. And Robert Mitchell's reaction to her name suggested that her carefully constructed identity might not be as secure as she had hoped. The game had just become infinitely more dangerous, and Emma wasn't sure which posed the greater threat, the man sitting beside her in the car, or the feelings he was awakening in her heart. Emma's hands shook as she inserted the key into the lock of her father's apartment. She had avoided coming here for 2 years, unable to face the place where James Carter had allegedly taken his own life. But something Robert Mitchell had said at the gala kept echoing in her mind. His reaction to her surname had been too specific, too knowing, and she needed to understand why. The apartment still smelled like her father's cologne and the coffee he drank every morning. Emma had paid to keep the lease current, unable to bring herself to pack up his belongings or let strangers live in the space where he had spent his final days. Now she was grateful for that decision. She moved through the rooms methodically, looking for anything the police might have missed. Her father had been paranoid in his final weeks, calling her with concerns about irregularities in the Sullivan Hotel's audit. He had mentioned keeping backup copies of everything, but Emma had assumed the police had confiscated all his work materials. In his bedroom, she pulled out dresser drawers, checked behind picture frames, and ran her hands along the undersides of furniture. Nothing. The police had been thorough in their search, taking his computer, work files, and anything that might explain his supposed state of mind. But James Carter had been clever, and he had trained Emma to think like him during the summers she worked at his accounting firm in college. If he wanted to hide something, he would put it somewhere personal, somewhere only family would think to look. Emma walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. On the top shelf sat a small metal box that had belonged to her grandmother, the same box where James had always kept Emma's report cards and school photos. Her heart hammered as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled between her college graduation photo and a letter she had written him from study abroad, was a USB drive. Emma's laptop was in her car, but she couldn't wait. She drove to the nearest coffee shop with Wi-Fi and plugged in the drive with trembling fingers. The contents made her blood run cold. Audio files, dozens of them, dating back over 2 years. Her father had been recording conversations, apparently without the other party's knowledge. Emma clicked on the most recent file, dated 3 days before his death. Robert Mitchell's voice filled her earbuds, crystal clear and damning. James, you need to stop asking questions about the Chicago property. Some things are better left alone. Her father's voice responded, tense but determined. The numbers don't add up, Robert. Someone's been skimming funds for months. The insurance claims, the construction overruns, the vendor payments, it's all connected. You're imagining things. The stress of this audit is getting to you. I have documentation, bank records, false invoices, ghost employees on the payroll. This isn't imagination, it's fraud. And it goes back years. A long pause, then Robert's voice, colder now. You have no idea what you're dealing with, James. This is bigger than you understand, and you're putting yourself in danger by pushing this. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to protect you. Drop this investigation, submit your report as approved, and walk away. Your daughter starts her master's program next year, doesn't she? Expensive degree. Would be a shame if something happened to affect her funding. Emma's breath caught. Robert had threatened her, used her as leverage against her father. You stay away from Emma. James's voice was steel. Whatever this is, she has nothing to do with it. Then we understand each other. Submit the clean report tomorrow, and everyone stays safe. The recording ended, and Emma sat frozen in the coffee shop, pieces clicking into place. Her father hadn't committed suicide. He had been murdered because he discovered Robert Mitchell's embezzlement scheme. She scrolled through more files, finding conversations between Robert and unknown parties discussing false insurance claims, inflated construction costs, and kickbacks from vendors. The scope was staggering. Millions of dollars stolen over years, all flowing through accounts that Robert controlled. But one detail stood out in every conversation. Robert operated independently. He made references to keeping Mason in the dark and ensuring that the boss never sees the real numbers. Mason wasn't involved. He was as much a victim of Robert's fraud as everyone else. Emma's phone buzzed with a text from Mason. Emergency board meeting moved to tonight. Need you there by 7 p.m. She looked at the clock. 6:30. She had 30 minutes to decide how to handle this information. 30 minutes to figure out how to tell the man she was falling for that she had been lying to him from the moment they met. Emma arrived at Sullivan Hotels as the board members were filing into the conference room. Mason stood at the head of the table, his expression grim as he reviewed documents. When he saw her, his face softened slightly. Thank you for coming on short notice, he said. Robert called this meeting. Something about irregularities in our quarterly reports. Emma's stomach dropped. Robert was making his move, probably planning to pin the fraud on someone else before her father's evidence could surface. Mason, she said quietly, I need to speak with you privately. It's urgent. After the meeting, Robert's already started his presentation. Through the conference room glass, Emma could see Robert at the front of the room, speaking animatedly to the board members while pointing at charts and graphs. She couldn't make out his words, but his body language suggested he was building towards something significant. No, Emma said firmly, grabbing Mason's arm. This can't wait. Something in her tone made Mason look at her more carefully. Emma, what's wrong? Robert Mitchell killed my father. The words came out in a rush, and Mason's face went completely still. What did you say? My name isn't Emma Carter. It's Emma Pemberton. My father was James Carter, the freelance accountant who audited your books 2 years ago. The one who supposedly committed suicide. Emma's voice was shaking now, but she forced herself to continue. He didn't kill himself, Mason. Robert murdered him because he discovered the embezzlement scheme. Mason stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. That's impossible. James Carter's audit came back clean. Robert showed me the reports. Reports that Robert forced my father to falsify under threat. Emma pulled out her phone, queuing up one of the audio files. I have recordings, Mason. Hours of them. Proof that Robert has been stealing from your company for years. She hit play, and Robert's voice filled the space between them, confessing to fraud, threatening James, discussing kickbacks and false insurance claims. Mason's face went through a series of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, devastating understanding. When the recording ended, Mason looked at Emma with something that might have been betrayal. You've been lying to me from the beginning. Yes. You came here to investigate me. You thought I was involved in your father's death. Yes. Emma's throat was tight, but I was wrong. The recordings prove you didn't know anything about the fraud. Mason turned away from her, staring through the conference room glass at Robert, who was still addressing the board. How long have you been planning this? The job application, the intervention with Marcus, everything? Months. Emma could barely get the words out. I studied you, researched your habits, created a false identity specifically to get close to you. And the kiss? Last night, outside the plaza? Was that part of your investigation too? The pain in his voice cut through Emma like a blade. No, that was real. Mason laughed, but there was no humor in it. Real? How am I supposed to know what's real with you? Before Emma could respond, the conference room door opened and Robert appeared, his face flushed with what looked like triumph. Mason, perfect timing, Robert said, his eyes flicking between them with sharp interest. I was just explaining to the board about some concerning financial irregularities we've discovered. I think we need to have a conversation about your new assistant. Emma saw the trap closing around them. Robert had called this meeting to frame her, to make it look like she was the one stealing from the company. He probably had fabricated evidence ready to present, making her the perfect scapegoat. Actually, Robert, Mason said, his voice deadly calm. I think we need to have a conversation about you. Emma watched as Mason made his choice, and despite everything that had just been revealed between them, he was choosing to protect her. Even knowing she had lied to him, manipulated him, investigated him like a criminal, he was still standing between her and Robert's trap. That's when Emma realized she was in love with him, just as she was about to lose him forever. Robert's confident smile faltered for just a moment when he saw Mason's expression, but he recovered quickly. I'm not sure what you mean, Mason. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, Mason said, his voice carrying the authority that had built a business empire. I think the board should hear this. Through the conference room glass, Emma could see the board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension between the two men. Robert's eyes darted between Mason and Emma, calculating his next move. Mason, I understand you've grown attached to Miss Carter, but the evidence is quite clear, Robert said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. Unauthorized access to financial records, irregularities in vendor payments that coincide with her hire date, and some very interesting background information about her true identity. Emma's blood turned to ice. He knew. Somehow, Robert had discovered who she really was. Her true identity? Mason's voice was dangerously quiet. Robert's smile was triumphant now. Meet Emma Pemberton, daughter of James Carter, the accountant who tried to destroy our company with false accusations before taking his own life. She's been playing you from the beginning, Mason. This whole romance, her convenient intervention with the waiter, even her impressive performance as your assistant, all calculated moves in a revenge plot. The words hit Mason like physical blows. Emma watched his face close off, the warmth that had been growing between them over the past weeks disappearing behind the cold mask she remembered from their first meeting. Is that true? Mason asked her, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The revenge part isn't true, Emma said desperately. I came here looking for answers, yes, but I never wanted revenge once I learned you weren't involved. How touching, Robert interrupted. But I'm afraid it doesn't matter what she wanted. The damage is done. She's accessed confidential files, potentially stolen proprietary information, and compromised our security protocols. The board will want her prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Actually, Mason said, turning back to Robert with renewed focus, I think the board will be more interested in hearing the recordings Emma found. Robert's face went very still. What recordings? Emma pulled out her phone again, but Robert moved faster than she expected for a man his age. He grabbed her wrist, squeezing until she dropped the device. The phone clattered across the marble floor, the screen cracking on impact. Careful, Miss Pemberton, Robert said, his voice no longer carrying any pretense of civility. Accidents happen so easily. Just ask your father. Mason stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. Let her go, Robert. Or what? You'll fire me? Robert laughed, but it was an ugly sound. I don't think you understand your position here, Mason. I've been embezzling from this company for 8 years, and I've been very careful to ensure that any investigation would lead back to you. That's impossible. I review every financial report. You review the reports I give you, which bear very little resemblance to reality. Robert released Emma's wrist and straightened his tie. Falsified documents, forged signatures, offshore accounts in your name. I've built quite the case against you over the years. Insurance fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. The authorities would be very interested in what I have to say. Emma saw the trap now. Robert hadn't just been stealing money. He had been setting Mason up as the fall guy from the beginning. If anyone discovered the fraud, all evidence would point to the CEO, not the CFO. "You killed my father because he discovered what you were doing," Emma said, her voice shaking with rage. "Your father was a problem that needed solving," Robert replied with chilling casualness. He was far too thorough in his audit, asked too many inconvenient questions. The suicide was actually quite believable. A man overwhelmed by financial pressures, unable to cope with his wife's medical bills. "My mother died 3 years before his audit," Emma said through gritted teeth. "Details," Robert waved dismissively. The police believed what they needed to believe. Mason's face had gone pale. "You murdered him." "I solved a business problem," Robert corrected. "Just like I'm about to solve the current problem." Before Emma could ask what he meant, Robert's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and smiled that cold, calculating smile that made Emma's skin crawl. "Ah, perfect timing," Robert said. "Mason, you should know that I have people watching your sister Jessica at her rehabilitation facility. Such a vulnerable time in her recovery. It would be tragic if something were to trigger a relapse." Mason went completely still. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about ensuring your cooperation. You see, Miss Pemberton here has become quite the liability. She has evidence that could unravel years of careful planning. That simply cannot be allowed." Emma realized with growing horror that Robert was no longer pretending to be the concerned CFO. He was revealing himself as something far more dangerous, a man who had killed once and was prepared to kill again. "Here's what's going to happen," Robert continued, his tone conversational despite the monstrous content of his words. "You're going to fire Miss Pemberton for corporate espionage and recommend prosecution. She'll disappear into the legal system, and any evidence she thinks she has will be dismissed as the fabrications of a vengeful daughter. Meanwhile, you'll continue to sign the documents I put in front of you, and Jessica will continue to receive the best care money can buy." "You're insane if you think I'll let you hurt her," Mason said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm not going to hurt anyone, as long as everyone cooperates." Robert's smile widened. "But accidents happen, Mason. Jessica could overdose on smuggled drugs. Miss Pemberton could suffer a breakdown and harm herself, just like her father. These things are tragic, but not uncommon." Emma felt sick. Robert wasn't just a thief. He was a sociopath who saw people as obstacles to be removed. Her father had been right to be afraid. "You have 1 hour to decide," Robert said, checking his expensive watch. "Send Miss Pemberton home, and we'll arrange for her unfortunate accident tonight. Refuse, and Jessica will receive a very special delivery at the rehabilitation center. I'm sure you remember how much she enjoyed cocaine." With that, Robert walked calmly back into the conference room, leaving Mason and Emma standing in the hallway, both shaken by the magnitude of what they had just heard. "I have to protect Jessica," Mason said, his voice hollow. "I know." Emma's heart was breaking, but she understood. She had spent 2 years obsessing over her father's death. She knew what it was like to lose family. "But I can't let him kill you." Emma looked up at him, seeing the anguish in his eyes. Despite everything, the lies, the deception, the investigation, he was still trying to protect her. "We'll find another way," she said, though she had no idea what that might be. Mason's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and his face went white. "What is it?" "A photo," Mason said, his voice barely audible. "Jessica unconscious in her room at the facility. The message says she's just sleeping, but it could easily be permanent." Emma realized they were out of time. Robert wasn't bluffing about Jessica, which meant he wasn't bluffing about anything else either. The man who had killed her father was about to kill again, and this time it would be her fault for bringing this danger into Mason's life. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Mason looked at her for a long moment, and Emma saw something in his eyes that looked like forgiveness. Or maybe it was just goodbye. "I know," he said, "but knowing that doesn't change what happens next." Mason stared at his phone screen, the image of his unconscious sister burning into his memory. Jessica looked peaceful, but the message was clear. Robert held all the cards, and he wasn't afraid to use them. "We have 45 minutes, Mason said, checking his watch. "He'll expect me to send you away, to let you walk into whatever trap he's set." Emma nodded, understanding the impossible position Robert had put them in. "Your sister comes first. I knew the risks when I started this." "No." Mason's voice was firm. There has to be another way. Emma's phone buzzed on the floor where Robert had thrown it. Despite the cracked screen, it was still functional. Mason picked it up, and Emma saw his expression change as he read the message. What does it say? Address in Brooklyn. Warehouse District. He wants you there in 30 minutes, alone. Mason's jaw clenched. Says if you bring anyone or call the police, Jessica dies first. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Robert was moving fast, forcing them into a corner with no good options. I have to go, she said, taking the phone from Mason. Maybe I can reason with him, make some kind of deal. You can't seriously think he'll let you live after what you've heard. Then at least Jessica will be safe. Mason grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. Robert has been planning this for years. He's thought through every contingency, every possible threat to his operation. He's not going to negotiate. Then what do you suggest? Mason was quiet for a moment, his mind racing through possibilities. The warehouse he's taking you to, it's not random. Robert owns property through shell companies all over the city. If I can figure out which one. How? The financial records in my office. If Robert's been using company funds to purchase properties, there'll be a paper trail. Mason started toward the elevator. Even if he's been covering his tracks, there'll be something. Emma followed him, but she could see the flaw in his plan. That could take hours. We don't have hours. We have what we have. They rode the elevator to Mason's floor in tense silence. Emma's mind was spinning, trying to think of any detail from the recordings that might help them locate Robert's warehouse. Her father had mentioned specific properties, specific bank accounts. The Chicago property, she said suddenly. In the recordings, Robert mentioned using a warehouse in Brooklyn for storing materials during the Chicago renovation. It was one of his shell companies. Mason's eyes lit up with understanding. Meridian Holdings. I remember questioning that expense report. He was already pulling files from his desk, scanning through documents with practiced efficiency. Here, he said, pointing to an invoice. Storage rental for construction materials, but the Chicago project ended 8 months ago. The lease is still active. Emma looked at the address. That's got to be it. Mason was already reaching for his phone, but Emma stopped him. You can't call the police, she said. He meant what he said about Jessica. Then what? Emma thought about her father, about the courage it must have taken for him to stand up to Robert, even when threatened. You go to the rehabilitation facility. Make sure Jessica is safe. I'll handle Robert. Absolutely not. Mason, he's expecting me to come alone. If you show up, he'll know we didn't follow his instructions. And if you go alone, you'll end up like your father. Emma pulled up the warehouse address on her phone's GPS 23 minutes to get there, assuming traffic cooperated. Then I guess I better be smarter than my father was. Before Mason could stop her, Emma was moving toward the elevator. He caught up with her at the doors, grabbing her hand. Emma, wait. She turned to face him, seeing the fear and frustration in his eyes. I have to do this. For my father, for Jessica, for everyone Robert has hurt. Let me come with you. We'll figure out a way to get Jessica to safety first. There's no time. Emma reached up and touched his face, memorizing the feel of his skin under her palm. Besides, someone needs to make sure the board knows the truth about what Robert's been doing. If something happens to me, you're the only one who can stop him. Mason caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. I can't lose you. Not now. Not when I'm just figuring out what you mean to me. You're not going to lose me, Emma said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. I'm going to record everything Robert says, get a confession that will put him away forever. Emma, I love you, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I know I have no right to say that after everything I've done, but I needed you to know. The elevator doors opened, and Emma stepped inside before Mason could respond. As the doors closed between them, she saw him reach out, his lips forming her name. 20 minutes later, Emma stood outside a corrugated metal warehouse in an industrial section of Brooklyn. The building looked abandoned, with broken windows and rust stains running down the sides like tears. Her phone showed no signal, which probably wasn't a coincidence. The main entrance was secured with a heavy padlock, but as Emma walked around the perimeter, she found a side door that had been left ajar. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she thought of her father's voice on those recordings, the courage he had shown even when facing death. Emma activated the voice recording app on her phone and slipped inside. The warehouse interior was vast and dim, filled with shadows cast by industrial equipment covered in tarps. Her footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, making stealth impossible. "Miss Pemberton," Robert's voice came from somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Right on time. I do appreciate punctuality." Emma moved toward the sound, her eyes adjusting to the low light. She could make out Robert's silhouette near what looked like an office area elevated above the main floor. "I'm here," she called out. "Now let Jessica go." "Jessica was never in any real danger," Robert replied, and Emma could hear the amusement in his voice. "That photograph was taken yesterday during her afternoon nap. Amazing what you can accomplish with the right contacts inside a medical facility." Emma felt sick. She had walked into a trap based on a lie, and Mason was probably racing to the rehabilitation center for nothing. "You played us perfectly," she said, climbing the metal stairs toward the office. "I've had a lot of practice. Your father thought he was clever too, right up until the end." Emma reached the office level and saw Robert standing behind a metal desk, looking perfectly composed despite the industrial setting. He had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, as if preparing for manual labor. "The beauty of this location," Robert continued conversationally, "is that it's completely soundproof. We can take all the time we need to discuss your situation." Emma's blood ran cold as she noticed the plastic sheeting spread across the floor behind Robert's desk and the industrial-grade cleaning supplies arranged on a nearby shelf. "You've done this before," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father wasn't my first problem employee," Robert confirmed, though he was certainly the most persistent. "I offered him a very generous severance package, and he refused to take it." Emma's hand moved instinctively toward her phone, making sure it was still recording. "How many people have you killed?" "Killed is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as aggressive human resources management." That's when Emma realized Robert had no intention of letting her leave the warehouse alive, regardless of what Mason did or didn't do. This wasn't about leverage or cooperation. This was about eliminating the last threat to his operation. And somewhere across the city, Mason was discovering that Jessica was perfectly safe, which meant he would be coming for Emma, if she could just stay alive long enough for him to find her. Mason burst through the doors of the Clearwater Rehabilitation Center like a man possessed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The receptionist looked up in alarm as he approached the desk, his usually impeccable appearance disheveled from his frantic drive across the city. "Jessica Sullivan," he said, trying to control his breathing. "I need to see her immediately. There's been a threat." "Mr. Sullivan?" The nurse on duty recognized him from his monthly visits. "Jessica's fine. She's in the garden with her therapy group. Is everything all right?" Mason felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "She's fine? She's conscious?" "Of course she's conscious. She's been making excellent progress this week." The photograph. The unconscious girl in the hospital bed. It had all been a lie, just as Emma suspected. Robert had played them perfectly, using Mason's love for his sister to manipulate him into sending Emma straight into a trap. "I need to call the police," Mason said, pulling out his phone. But there was no time to explain the complex web of fraud and murder to skeptical officers. By the time he convinced them to take him seriously, Emma would be dead. Mason ran back to his car, his mind racing through options. The warehouse address was burned into his memory, but he had no idea what he would find when he got there. Robert had been planning this for years. He wouldn't have chosen a location without considering every angle. As Mason sped toward Brooklyn, he called the head of security for Sullivan Hotels, a former NYPD detective named Sarah Chun who had helped him deal with difficult situations before. "Sarah, I need backup at a warehouse in Brooklyn," Mason said, giving her the address. "Armed and dangerous situation. How fast can you get there?" 20 minutes, Sarah replied without asking questions. "What am I walking into? Hostage situation. The CFO of my company has been embezzling for years and killed a man to cover it up. Now he has my assistant." "On my way." Mason disconnected and pressed harder on the accelerator. 20 minutes might be too long. Meanwhile, in the warehouse, Emma was playing for time, knowing that Mason would eventually realize he had been deceived. Robert seemed to be enjoying their conversation, the way a cat enjoys playing with a mouse before delivering the killing blow. "Your father really was remarkably persistent," Robert was saying, moving around the desk toward her. "Even when I explained the consequences of his continued investigation, he insisted on doing the right thing. Admirable, really, if somewhat naive." Emma backed away, trying to keep the desk between them. He was a good man. He deserved better than what you did to him. What I did to him was a kindness. A quick fall from a balcony is much more merciful than what happens to people who cross certain organizations. Robert's smile was cold. You see, Miss Pemberton, I haven't been working alone in this endeavor. The money I've been skimming from Sullivan Hotels has been funding some very important business relationships. Emma's blood chilled as she understood the implication. Robert wasn't just an embezzler. He was connected to organized crime. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than she had imagined. Money laundering, she said. Among other things, Mason's hotels provide excellent opportunities for cleaning funds from various enterprises. Construction projects, vendor relationships, cash-heavy restaurant operations. It's quite elegant, really. And if Mason ever discovered what you were doing, Mason was always meant to take the fall eventually. I've been building a case against him for years. When the authorities investigate, they'll find offshore accounts in his name, forged documents with his signature, a pattern of fraud that points directly to the top. Emma realized that Robert's plan was even more diabolical than she had thought. He wasn't just stealing money. He was systematically destroying Mason's life, setting him up to be the scapegoat for a massive criminal enterprise. You'll never get away with this, Emma said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. I've been getting away with it for 8 years. One more unfortunate accident won't change anything. That's when they heard the sound of metal doors slamming open somewhere below in the warehouse. Robert's expression darkened. It seems your boyfriend didn't follow instructions. Emma's heart leaped with hope and terror in equal measure. Mason had come for her, but he was walking into a trap. Emma. Mason's voice echoed through the cavernous space. Where are you? Robert pulled a gun from his desk drawer, and Emma's hope curdled into fear. This complicates things, but not fatally. 2 accidents are just as believable as one. You don't have to do this, Emma said desperately. There's another way. There's always another way, Miss Pemberton. I simply prefer this one. Robert moved toward the stairs leading down to the main floor, gesturing for Emma to follow. She could see Mason's silhouette moving between the covered equipment below, searching for her. Mason, it's a trap, Emma screamed, just as Robert shoved her toward the stairs. The warning saved Mason's life. Robert's first shot went wide as Mason dove behind a stack of crates. Emma used the distraction to wrench herself away from Robert, stumbling down the metal stairs toward the main floor. Emma, stay down, Mason called out, his voice coming from somewhere in the maze of covered machinery. Robert fired again, the bullet sparking off metal near Emma's head. She rolled behind a concrete pillar, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. This is pointless, Mason, Robert called out, his voice eerily calm. I have all the evidence I need to destroy you. Even if you kill me, you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. Maybe, Mason replied, his voice moving as he worked his way closer. But at least Emma will be alive to testify about what really happened. Emma heard footsteps on the stairs behind her and realized Robert was coming down to the main floor. She needed to move, but any movement would reveal her position. That's when she heard the sound of vehicles pulling up outside the warehouse, car doors slamming, authoritative voices shouting orders. NYPD. Building is surrounded. Sarah Chin's voice cut through the chaos. Drop your weapon and come out with your hands visible. Robert's composure finally cracked. Emma could hear him cursing, his footsteps moving frantically as he looked for an escape route. It's over, Robert, Mason said, emerging from behind the machinery with his hands raised as police officers stormed into the warehouse. The FBI is probably going through your financial records right now. The next few minutes were a blur of shouting, flashing lights, and controlled chaos as law enforcement secured the scene. Robert tried to run, but was tackled by 2 officers near a rear exit. Emma found herself wrapped in Mason's arms, both of them shaking with relief and adrenaline. I thought I'd lost you, Mason whispered into her hair. I'm sorry, Emma said, pulling back to look at him. I'm sorry for lying to you, for investigating you, for putting you in danger. You were trying to find the truth about your father. I understand that now. 6 months later, Emma stood on a windswept beach in Cape Cod, wearing her grandmother's vintage lace dress and a smile that felt like it might split her face in half. The ceremony was small, just a few close friends and Jessica, who had completed her rehabilitation program and was glowing with health and sobriety. Mason looked handsome in his Navy suit, but more importantly, he looked happy. The legal proceedings following Robert's arrest had been complicated and exhausting, but the truth had finally come out. Robert was facing charges for murder, fraud, and racketeering, and his connections to organized crime had unraveled a much larger criminal enterprise. "Do you, Emma Pemberton, take Mason Sullivan to be your husband?" "I do," Emma said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. When they kissed, the small gathering erupted in cheers, and Emma felt her father's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. 2 years later, the James Carter Foundation for Whistleblower Protection occupied an entire floor of a building in downtown Manhattan. Emma sat in her office, reviewing applications for legal assistance from people who had discovered fraud in their workplaces and needed protection to come forward. Mason appeared in her doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the smile that still made her heart skip beats. "How's the Morrison case coming?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "We'll have enough evidence to present to the authorities by Friday," Emma replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Thanks to the foundation, Mrs. Morrison won't have to face the same choice my father did." Mason reached across the desk and took her hand, his thumb tracing the wedding ring that still felt new and wonderful on her finger. "Your father would be proud," he said. Emma smiled, looking out the window at the city her father had loved, the city where they had built something good from something terrible. "I know," she said. "I can feel it." Outside, New York pulsed with its usual energy, full of people pursuing dreams and justice and love. And in a small office dedicated to protecting those brave enough to speak truth to power, 2 people who had found each other in the darkness were helping to make the world a little brighter.